God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
My goodness, today's readings offer an absolute wealth of possibility. We could talk about the role of first century eunuchs. Does that sound exciting? We could talk about the abiding love that God has for all of us. That sounds like we're getting closer to the right track. We could talk about the vine that we're all part of as the church, that's connected and rooted to one another and to Christ and Christ to us. Now I think we're really on target. These would all be wonderful sermon topics today, but they're not today's sermon. I'd like to talk a little bit about how they might be connected, though, to something that happened on Wednesday, which I'm sure everybody knows exactly what was special about Wednesday, right? We all took Wednesday off and devoted the whole day to our patronal festival of St. Mark, right? We do that? Must confess I didn't do that. But this past Wednesday was St. Mark's Day in the life of the church. And many churches do observe this day with special observances. Mark is our patron, our spiritual sponsor, as it will. And so when we talk about Mark as our patron, I think it's important for us to know a little bit more about Mark than we know about any other saint. So I'd like us to have a crash course on Mark. And I think out of this, we are going to find something very interesting and relevant to our own spiritual journeys. So, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to read one paragraph out of Holy Women, Holy Men on St. Mark. And I'm going to highlight a sentence when I finish that paragraph. And don't worry, it's not a long paragraph. This isn't a history lesson. But Holy Women, Holy Men says, a disciple of Jesus named Mark appears in several places in the New Testament. If all the references to Mark can be accepted as referring to the same person, more on this in a second. We learn he was the son of a woman who owned a house in Jerusalem, perhaps the same house in which Jesus ate the Last Supper with his disciples. Mark may have been the young man who fled naked when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. In his letter to the Colossians, Paul refers to Mark as the cousin of Barnabas, who was with him in his imprisonment. He set out with Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey, but he turned back for reasons which failed to satisfy Paul. When another journey was planned, Paul refused to have Mark with him. Instead, Mark went with Barnabas to Cyprus. The breach between Paul and Mark was later healed, and Mark became one of Paul's companions in Rome and was a close friend of St. Peter. The sentence I'd like us to extract is, if all references to Mark can be accepted as referring to the same person. They can, or they cannot. It really is up to biblical scholars to decide where you fall on that spectrum. They may have been two people. There may have been three people with the name of Mark. I'd like us to imagine for a moment that we are all theological scholars, and we've decided to adopt the theory for the morning that there are three Marks. There is Mark, the disciple, Mark, the evangelist, and Mark, the man in the Garden of Gethsemane. And to apply those three Marks to our own spiritual journey, because I think they each have something special to say. First, Mark, the disciple. Mark the disciple is the one who walked with Jesus. Mark the disciple is the one who accompanied St. Paul and who got into some kind of argument with St. Paul. There was a disagreement, and later that disagreement was healed, and the two became friends again. How are we, my friends, called to walk with Jesus? How are we called to walk with one another as fellow disciples, even when we get into disagreements and get upset with one another? How are we called to be reconciled beyond those disagreements, more nearly to return to the path that Jesus has set out for us to do? That's discipleship. That's what we need to be in our world today. That's Mark the disciple, the follower, the failer, the reconciler, and a reuniter. Mark the evangelist. Oh, I'm sorry, I just used that word again. Okay, I promise not to use it too much. Mark the evangelist is the one who sat down and penned the Gospel of Mark, or whose community penned his words on his behalf at some point. We really don't know, because Mark's Gospel is the oldest of all the Gospels. It's why we have these lions all around the church, because lions are symbols of ancient royalty. And Mark's called the Royal Gospel because it's the oldest Gospel. It's the Gospel that when Matthew, Luke, and John sat down to write their Gospels, and when the other Gospel writers of the almost 30 other Gospel fragments that aren't complete, so they're not put in the Bible, but those Gospels, they all seem to be based on Mark. Mark is the skeleton of the story. It's the essence of the Christian message is in Mark. So Mark is the great evangelist. And you and I are inheritors of that ancient royal charge to speak about Jesus, to try to model who we are even as we stumble along, as Mark the disciple did, but charged to speak out about who Jesus is in our world. We often talk about being the hands and the heart of Christ and trying to have the feet of Christ to take us where we need. But we don't often talk about being the voice of Christ. But that is part of who we are. That is who we are as evangelists in the church. The third Mark is the Mark who was in the Garden of Gethsemane, who was wearing only a cloth. When the soldiers came, was so frightened, and he ran, and the gospel says he fled naked into the night. My friends, that is a huge part of this. How hard it is to open our souls to the point of nakedness. I don't know about you, but I think that's probably the biggest challenge of being a Christian, is accepting vulnerability and being open to what God is trying to show us or would show us, whether it be discipleship or evangelists or forgiving our neighbor, or even perhaps more importantly, forgiving ourselves. It's bearing who we are to a God who is going to show us unconditional love and having trust and faith in that love to do what is best for us wherever we find ourselves to be. So today I'd like to leave us with 3 marks. A disciple walking in footsteps of the Lord, an evangelist living a life and trying to set it before others, and a vulnerable person who opens oneself and one's life to God and recognizes the vulnerability of our neighbor and seeks to be Christ for them as well. Amen.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?